Good afternoon. My name is David Larson, and I live in Edmonds, Washington. And I want to take this opportunity to thank the Deep Sea Fishermen's Union and the University of Washington Archives for this opportunity to participate in their oral history endeavors. Been married for 36 years, and all those years in the fishing industry, I've had the opportunity, I've had a blessing to be associated with some very incredibly and tremendous people. So yeah, I had my early start in the fishing business was in 1961. At the tender age of 13, I was gill netting on Puget Sound with my brother. He was 6 years older than I was. We fished in Port Susan along the upper Puget Sound. At that time in Port Susan, the kayak point where we were fishing off of, that was the home to Atlantic Richfield, had a large refinery in Kayak Point. It's all gone now, but it was a spot that we used to fish under the lights of the oil refinery, and in the evening we would pitch off our fish in one of the local harbors. Period ran from 7 at night until 7 in the morning, and we pitched off and got in a truck and made it back to school for first period classes, for which I slept through after a night in fresh air. So shortly after we got done with our gill netting career, my older brother got the idea that he wanted to go to Alaska and seek out an ocean that he perceived to be full of halibut. So as a younger brother, I teamed up and we got a bigger boat and we took off. As one older fisherman told us, that you had to learn how to dead reckon, and if you couldn't dead reckon, he said, I reckon you'll be dead. So with that in mind, we left Everett, heading north. At that time, I was 14 years old, didn't have a driver's license yet, but I was still put in a position where I had to stand a 6-hour watch. Sometimes that 6-hour watch morphed into 8-hour watches, but all we had was a fathometer, a compass, no radar, no plotters, nothing that we associate with the industry now. But what we had was, at that young age, I had a lot of common sense, and I was very sensitive about what was going on around me. The salvation, of course, for navigation was Captain Hansen's. Without Captain Hansen's handbook and sticking your head out the window, that was how we navigated, and we made it. The first years weren't too successful, but we learned an important component in the fishing business, in that you can have the oceans full of halibut or black cod or whatever, and you can go up there with the intent of seeking your fortune, but it's not how hard you work that we found. It was knowing how to work. And as a couple greenhorns we hadn't longlined before, that was one of the things that we learned, and that was through the school of hard knocks. The areas that we went to many times, looking back on it, how we escaped disaster, or how I can even be here today telling you the story about what went on. We certainly had our hand in God's pocket throughout our early days in the fishing business. After the time with the smaller boat, I went into college, and after graduating from college, I still had the bug to go fishing. So so I got a bigger boat, and then that boat I sold. It was a little trawler, and then we got had an opportunity to buy the halibut schooner Arctic, and that was my dream. I had always wanted to have a schooner, and I wanted to be able to roam the oceans with its legendary freedom the schooners have always provided to their owners. And I have written a few comments that I have that are associated with the schooner Arctic, but they're also relevant to just about any schooner, whether the fact that in this case the schooner Arctic was just 65 feet long. Many of the other schooners are larger, but the story that I've written gives you a good indication of how the transition in history that these schooners were in. Not only the boat itself and the various construction, new pilot houses, wooden pilot houses, engines, everything, but it's also a little bit of a story of the men that made all that happen. These men were hard workers, strong work ethic, but they learned to work with their head and their hands, and they were craftsmen, and a few of them worked with their hands and their heart. And for those people, they were true artists and wonderful, wonderful people. Before I start this accounting, I have to really say that without the support of the wives, the sweethearts, and the mothers that were associated with the longline trade, we wouldn't be here having this interview. In case my mother, she supported us both financially and with her heart and with her love. And I think that to those women and to those families, we owe them a tremendous debt. So this is what I have written. The fishing vessel Arctic was launched at Tacoma Boat Building in 1961. Sliding into the waters of Commencement Bay, her proud owner, Adolph Samuelson, looking on. America was just 16 years into a new century. Roads, dams, buildings were being built in record numbers. Model A and Model T Fords were just coming off of the new assembly line. The Pacific Northwest, Tacoma, Seattle, Gig Harbor were all being settled by laborers and craftsmen from Sweden, from Norway, from Yugoslavia, Croatia, Germany. They came with a dream of a better life, and with it a work ethic unparalleled. The men, tools, and would sustain the shipyards through a building surge that lasted from 1910 to 1960. Shipyards were springing up to meet the demands of the maritime. Ferries, freighters, pleasure craft were being built as America embraced luxury afloat. The gasoline and diesel engines designed for marine applications was to usher in untold opportunities in the fishing business. Sailing ships still moored at the wharfs in Lake Union. The Aurora Bridge, its center span, left open to allow their departure. Beautiful ships destined for the breaking yards of South America. Many to be raped of their masts and turned into barges. Master sailmaker and my very good friend Rupert Broom saw the art of sailmaking disappearing. Rupert Broom was emphatic that I carry on the Arctic should a set of sails should ever the engine fail. He had not built a sail like the one he built for me for many years. The material, 10-ounce jack round, was somewhere up in the loft that he had to blow the dust off to make it work. But he was so tickled to be able to make a sail for me. The lumber and materials needed to rebuild San Francisco after the Great Fire were carried on ships from the Pacific Northwest, powered by sails from the loft of George Broom and his sons. The fishing industry in 1916 was just touching the edges of the salmon and halibut resources of coastal Washington, Hecate, the Devil Strait in BC, southeast Alaska, and the Gulf and westward. Seaworthy vessels capable of carrying a crew of 6 to 8 were being built. The cost of construction often covered by partnerships among immigrant families that shared in a common dream of success in a new frontier. Sagstead Boat Building in Salmon Bay built many of the early fishing vessels. Fishing vessel owners Marineways, Tacoma Boat, Seattle Shipbuilding, Scansy Shipbuilding, and Gig Harbor struggled to meet the needs of Puget Sound and the Alaska fishermen. Many of these yards still operate today. The Arctic was not unlike many of the some 150 halibut schooners that were built between 1910 and 1860. Traditional methods of construction, the choice of woods, were all influenced by the cultures and backgrounds of the men that worked the yards. Stalwart vessel names like Arctic, Polaris, Vancy, Republic, Resolute, Bergen, Tordenskjold, Masonic, Northern, and Tor reflected the solid determination and vision of the early owners, the allure and elan of fishing. The hopes of catches yet to be made are a common thread woven through the names of the schooner fleet. The gasoline engine was being introduced. Sail power had been proved dependable but labor intensive, and was given way to the reciprocating engine and the reverse gear transmission. The first engine in the Arctic was gasoline. It was soon replaced with the emergence of the slow-speed, heavy-duty diesel. Arctic's first repowering replaced the gasoline engine with an Atlas Imperial. This engine would deliver 65 horsepower at a very slow RPM. This Atlas would stay in her until 1940, as it did in a lot of the schooners. The Gray Marine would stay in the vessel until it was sold in 1982. After the Second World War, surplus engines, electronics, and building materials found their way into the fishing industry. They supplied the reasonable, dependable, and inexpensive improvements to the fleet. The working staysail was attached to the boom amidships, rigged with wooden bands that allowed it to be hoisted up and down the forward mast. The mast itself was lightly greased so that the collar of the boom could slide up and down. Further aft, there was a small sail on the aft mast. That was called a leg of mutton. Both these sails were important, and they were held onto by most of the schooner owners, because this was a way, if the engine should ever fail, they were comfortable in being able to work their way offshore. The Arctic in the winter of 1982 sat at the Marineways surrounded by an attentive group of craftsmen. I knew many of them. What I didn't know, which was a lot, they seemed to know. They were dependable. All they would do was smile, and they would say, well, we'll fix it right. I didn't know what they were doing, but whatever they did, it was the correct way. All their work in the shipyard at that time, in later years that I had the Arctic and was involved with the wooden construction, was steeped in a lot of tradition, along with a strong work ethic. There was a way to do it, and that worked, and you didn't really try to reinvent the wheel. It was a very steady approach to how these boats were maintained. The legendary seaworthiness of the schooner fleet and others is legendary. We have many times when I had the Arctic, I would be caught in severe storms offshore with seas 20 to 30 feet cresting. I would be unable to see the large waves at night, and I would pump the bilges free, turn off or idle the engine, and let her drift. Falling asleep, rocked to and fro by huge ocean swells. The harder the wind blew, her bow would be forced downwind. I could hear the waves and the wind driven rushing underneath the hull. I was never afraid, but maybe a little concerned. When I went to Midway, I was caught in a tropical depression and drifted for 3 days in mountain-high seas and torrential rains. The boat never let me down. She was built with sawn frames, as many of the schooner fleet was, from the forests of Puget Sound. The curve in the frames, the ribs, were sawn right out of a large piece of wood. They made for incredible strength. As a young man, I found myself immersed in the traditions and tempo of life in the shipyard. I was like a sponge, listening to the carpenters and fitters as they worked on the boat. Little was said, a lot was accomplished. Their advice I treasured. I knew these men and their traditions in wood would one day disappear. I would look forward to my lunch with him. These men, that while quiet and hard-working, radiated what it meant to be a craftsman. These men worked for their hearts and their mind, and it was just I was looking back on it, it was a wonderful opportunity. I was a lucky guy. These men were from the different yards in the 20s and 30s would gather their expertise, and they would build the schooner fleet or build other wooden halibut boats, and they would move from yard to yard, corkers, interior craftsmen. They came from everywhere to complete a job. The fishing in Alaska for me in the longline business gave way to an opportunity to get involved in the freezer longline trade, where the cod fishing was done with a lot of automation. These are things that I saw coming to fruition in the 90s and early 2000. It was a time when technology, driven a lot by efficiencies, crews wanting to run as many hooks as possible to catch as many fish as they could. The introduction of the baiting machines, which allow boat owners and captains to set 60,000 hooks a day and retrieve that many. There was a tremendous resource. And I was lucky enough in the latter part of 1980 and 1990 to be on one of the first of the freezer longliners to harvest Pacific cod in this manner. And even after the 90s, and there was a lot of changes in the crew as the demands for more efficiencies, for working 24 hours a day. The crews were changing from small boat mentality. Small boat crews gave way to crews of 21 and 18 and even more. But the boats had to be built. New boats had to be built, and there had to be an embracing of a new measure when it came to the deck crews. I started out on deck and worked my way up through from being a deckhand to being a mate, and then going on to being a captain on a freezer longliner. And it was a slow process, but I made it, and I'm very fortunate to be here and to be able to tell you a little bit about the industry. One thing that in 1961, when we first made our first trip to Alaska, or when we were first gill netting, and then later on when we came to Alaska, to put things in context at that time, my mother had just purchased a Volkswagen Beetle in Everett, and that was new for $1,700. When we got to Ketchikan the first time, and we got off the dock, both my brother and I felt like Christopher Columbus, because we had never been to Alaska. We had this book, Captain Hanson's, that showed us the way, but we were cautious, and we made it. And one of the things that describes the time was that the diesel fuel was 19 cents a gallon, and a pack of Lucky Strikes, if that's what you were smoking, was a quarter. And watching the boats from out west offload to New England Fish Company, the top price of halibut at that time was 32 cents a pound. And a good jacket was $1.50 for the trading post. So throughout all this, we had a dream, It was a spirit of adventure. We knew that success was just around the corner. We had to work hard. As I said earlier, it was knowing how to work was the key, and that and that we learned through the School of Hard Knocks, and a lot of hard work in itself. The fishing industry, as I saw it growing up from the 60s and 70s and 80s, there was so much of there was a tempo of life on the dock. There was a work ethic that was unparalleled. There was a tradition, and these three elements have always been there. They're part of the fabric of these gentlemen that looked at things with under their white Ballard Stetson fish hat. They were never really surprised at anything. Everything was taken with a grain of salt, and when they opened their mouth to say anything, I was there to listen. Wasn't there to do much talking, because these gentlemen knew a lot, and they were first class. They were just first class people. A lot of integrity, and very willing to help, even a greenhorn. Some of the things I did, they would come by, scoff at. Then they would tell me how to fix the problem. When I had the Arctic in the shipyard at Fishing Vessel Owners, I put a new forward mast on the boat, and as the mast was laying alongside the boat, one of the local fishermen, Larson Peterson, he came by, walked with a cane, and the front of his shirt was stained with cigarette burns, and he always had half a growth of hair in his chin. And he looked down at that wooden mast, and he says, son, he says, before you put that mast up, you're going to have to have the shipyard, you're going to have a truck put on it. And I looked at Nelson, I says, a truck? I looked over at my truck, and he says, no. He says, you go into the shipyard and you ask Big Harry Lund, the Finn, what it is for a truck. So I went into the carpenter shop, and I asked Harry, I said, I need a truck for the top of my mast. Like I knew what I was talking about. I didn't. And Harry sort of looked at me, sort of a sly grin, and he says, who have you been talking to? I said, well, I was just talking to my friend Larson Peterson. He said that's what I needed. And he says, yes. He said, I'll make you one. And as it turned out, the truck was just a little round piece of wood, and it was milled so that it would fit right on top of the grain, right on top of the mast, and was nailed down to protect the water from going down the end grain of the mast and rotting it out. Had I not put that truck there, well, then the mast would have deteriorated in a relatively short period of time. So feeling quite confident now, I took the mast with the truck on it, and I took it back to the boat, and I was getting ready to stand it up a second time. And Nelson came by the second time, and he says, you can't put that up without putting a spike in the top of the mast. At that time, the mast was a beautiful piece of wood, and I thought, why am I going to put a spike in the top of the mast? And he says, you go over and ask Marvin in the shipyard office why it is that you need a spike. So I went over, and Marvin explained to me that without that spike, he says, you'll have every seagull in the port shitting down the side of your mast. So I did that, and sure enough, that solved the problem. And I had a great mast, and it was free of bird shit. So that was a real deal, These are all things I learned along the way and I credit that not only to my a lot to my naivete at the time, but also my willingness to listen to some men that knew far more than I did. And for that I'll be eternally grateful. In the years ahead, when I went to Alaska on the, as captain on the freezer longliners and on bigger boats, some of them up as 300-400 feet long, and I had the responsibility for a crew of 200 and 300 people. I always remembered those early trips with our little halibut boat, where everything was done looking out the window. Everything was done by seat of the pants navigation, but I was cautious and I exercised common sense. And with those two things, that has safeguarded me through my entire career as a sailor, as a master, and as a fishing captain. It's been a really wonderful thing to have had the opportunity. And my wife, whom I've been married to for 36 years, she, as well as the many wives and girlfriends and sweethearts that support the guys on the boats, she's made everything work for me. I would not have anything today if it wasn't for her. So I consider myself a lucky guy on a lot of fronts. A lot of the fishing industry was centered around the idea of speed and of efficiencies and making things so that the work could get done and do it in such a way to be as kindly to the body as possible. This is something that the industry learned sometimes through the School of Hard Knocks, which was attorneys and other people, suing people and making it difficult for boat owners sometimes to get good crews. The crews came to be educated in a little bit different way. Where back in the 60s and 70s, 80s, the typical longliner or the typical fisherman would accept his share, and he would work with the idea of being more productive and maybe moving up the ladder and making more money. As time went on, more and more of the crew just expected that they have the top share right away. And I, as the time went by, as a captain and as a boat owner, I became a little bit jaded with the fact that everybody wanted something without having first to work their way up. Early on in the halibut trade, a lot of the shares in the boats were voted. They were voted by the full share guys, and that was a process that was part of tradition. The Deep Sea Fishermen's Union and the agreement between the boat owners and the crew members, and the voting of shares was all a process of people working up the ladder, people aspiring to be better and working as a team to make the boat successful. As the years went by, something occurred where there wasn't the requirement or the desire for the crew member was to have all the money up front, and then along the way they were going to learn something. And that ran counter to anything that I understood. But nevertheless, it happens today, so the industry has to be very cautious about who they hire and how they're worked. The longline trade now, for the larger boats, the freezer longliners, is on a 24-hour basis. The smaller boats that encompass the Deep Sea Fishermen's Union are still working maybe a few less hours, but there isn't a member of those crews that don't remember the days when they did work the long hours and they made the long trips, and they worked together as a team. And that's a wonderful a wonderful thing as time went on that I learned, having started my fishing career on deck, was when you get a bunch of fellows together and you learn to work together and you're a team, and even when you're totally exhausted and you seem like you can't budge one more step, it's everyone else that's in that same shape seems to pick up the slack, or you help the other person or he helps you. Mysteriously the job gets done, and it's because of that close bond that is shared, and even after the season is over, the fishermen wind up calling their buddy, even though they've probably got tired of looking at his mug for the last 4 months. They seek their friends out, and they're very appreciative of the long hours spent together.
Well, thank you for your input, Dave, and we had a couple additional questions here. One was, what are your hopes regarding the future for commercial longlining?
Well, my hope for the future, is tied to the young men and their families that are starting the steps, working up the ladder. I know that it will. I know that it will continue to be a method of fishing. I think how it will be conducted and the people will change, and they will, and I really hope that they, will embrace the tempo of life and the traditions that are associated with longlining, and make a good life for themselves and their families.
And finally, this being conducted by the Deep Sea Fishermen's Union, just curious, over the course of your career, what were your interactions with the Deep Sea Fishermen's Union? Well,
I first got involved, peripherally with the Deep Sea Fishermen's Union through a good friend of mine, Mark Larson, who first got his first trip on my halibut schooner when I brought it back to Seattle. He later on went on to work on the Grant, and then during the time he was on the Grant, he became quite involved with the development of the IFQs. Some would say to a point where he actually was one of the fathers of the IFQs. His relationship with the union and the boat owners, the people that he fished with, just reaffirmed in my mind how much the union played in developing the longline industry.
Okay, that's good.